I was standing at the front door of my own house, ringing the bell. Nobody answered. I called my son. His phone was off. I called my daughter. She did not pick up. I stood there for 15 minutes in the cold afternoon, staring at the locked door of the house where I had lived for 32 years. I knew people were inside. I could hear the television. I could see a light on the second floor. And then it became clear to me, this was not a misunderstanding or an accident. This was a plan. Someone had decided I was no longer coming in, and that someone had the key to my house. I went back to my car and sat down. I didn't drive away. I just stared at that locked door, finally understanding everything. To understand that door, you have to understand 10 years. 10 years in which I gave Walter and Patricia everything I had: money, space, patience, silence. Walter married Diane, whose parents, from the very first day, looked at my house with that quiet appraiser's gaze I know from construction. You look at a property and calculate what it is worth and what you would do with it. Behind me were two pensions, mine and Margaret's, who died 5 years before. In that house was all our history, and now I was standing in front of a locked door, listening to the television inside, and beginning to understand what was really happening. Before I continue, I need to ask you something. Has anyone in your family, a son-in-law, a son, a daughter, started making decisions about things that are yours in the last few years without asking you? I am not talking about something large and obvious. I am talking about small things. A lock changed without your knowledge. An account someone else suddenly has access to. A conversation about your house they had without you. If you have ever felt something like that, write yes in the comments right now and stay. Because what I did in the following week is something every property owner needs to know. If this is your first time watching, subscribe to the channel. This story will change how you protect your own assets. My name is Frank Dolan. I am 71 years old, retired civil engineer, 37 years with the same firm. My Margaret died of a heart attack 5 years ago. I have lived alone since then. The house is mine. My name is the only one on the deed. I bought it in cash in 1991, extended it in 2003, put a new roof on it in 2015. Every square foot I know why it is there. Walter is our son, Patricia our daughter. Both of them grew up in that house. Diane is Walter's wife, a good woman at her core, but whose parents had a plan from the very beginning. I never needed to argue with them about it, until the day I stood in front of that changed lock. I am not a man who is easily rattled. 40 years calculating load-bearing structures teaches you that problems have solutions, and that panic does not help. But what I felt in front of that door was not panic. It was something slower and colder. Recognition. Like when you look at a structure and see that the main support beam is missing, and everyone has been living in that building as if everything were fine. I was standing in front of that door recognizing 10 years of concessions, 10 years of silence, 10 years of assuming we were all on the same side. We were not. Perhaps we never entirely had been. The house sits on a quiet street in Indianapolis. My father laid the foundation in 1960. I bought it from my siblings in 1991 when we divided the estate. I extended it and renovated it over the years. Margaret planted a rose garden along the fence that blooms every spring without anyone tending it specially. In the basement I have shelves with Margaret's preserves, strawberry jam, apple butter, bread and butter pickles, all from 2018, her last year. I never touched them. The house was full of her. And now someone had changed the lock on that house and said, "You do not come in anymore." Not Diane directly, not Walter directly, but together, in silence, with a plan they had put together while I was out. In the living room, there is an armchair by the window that looks out onto the garden. It was Margaret's. She always sat there to read or watch the garden. After her death, I sat in that armchair once and never again. I did not throw it away, did not cover it, did not move it. It stood empty, and every time I walked past it, I knew it was there, that it had been there, that the house remembers. This is the house whose door someone locked and said, "You do not come in anymore." And standing outside that door, hearing the television through the walls, I understood that their plan was nearly complete without me ever knowing it existed. Diane's father, Gary, came into our life slowly. At first, he was pleasant and attentive, came to dinners and praised Margaret's cooking, even when I was the one cooking. But over the years, he and Linda started coming more often, started commenting on the house, asking about maintenance, comparing prices in the neighborhood. Once Gary said it was a shame a house like this was so underused. I told him it was not underused. I lived there. He did not respond. He just nodded and changed the subject, the way someone does who already knows what is going to happen and does not need to discuss it any further. Walter started changing his tone around the 7th year of his marriage. He came less often alone and more often with Diane and her parents. At one family dinner, Gary suggested that perhaps the most practical arrangement would be for Walter and Diane to take over the house and for me to move to a smaller apartment. He said it the way someone suggests a new seating arrangement, without hesitation. I looked at Walter and waited. Walter said it was one option, just that, one option. In my ears, those 2 words sounded like a concrete plan that already existed, and for which they only needed my agreement or my absence. The day of the door I had not called ahead because I did not know that was necessary. It was my house. I went out early for a medical appointment, came back in the afternoon, parked and walked toward the front door. The key did not work. I thought they had changed the lock. I rang the bell. Nobody answered. I called Walter. Off. I called Patricia. No answer. I stood there for 15 minutes and for the first time in my life felt what it is to be outside your own home. Not in any figurative sense, literally outside. With a key that did not work and a television playing inside. And then it became perfectly clear what was happening and why. Stop for a moment. I want you to think about something concrete before I continue. Is your name the only one on the deed to your property? And can anyone modify your accounts or real estate without your signature and your physical presence? Most people assume the answer is no. Most people are wrong. Write "continue" in the comments if you own property, and stay, because what I discovered in the following week changed every document I have. This was not about having a lawyer as a luxury. This was about a lawyer as the only tool that works when a plan is already near its end. The attorney was named Dennis Hartley. He had an office in downtown Indianapolis and was a contemporary of mine I had known since my years at the firm. I called him from my car sitting outside my own house. I said only, "Dennis, I need help. The lock has been changed. I cannot get in." Dennis said, "Come in right now." I sat across from him and told him everything. 10 years, Gary and Linda, Walter's proposal, the locked door. Dennis listened without interrupting. At the end, he said one thing. "Frank, what they did is a crime. The deed says your name, and what they did is called unlawful exclusion. Tomorrow we file." That night I slept in a downtown hotel. It was not a dramatic situation. I had a card, I had luggage in the car, I had money. But lying in that hotel bed looking at the ceiling, I thought about Margaret's preserves on the shelves in the basement, about the rose garden that blooms alone every spring, about the empty armchair by the window, and I thought about Walter, about the boy who learned to walk in that hallway, who learned to read at that table, who once brought Diane home and said, "Dad, this is her," and who had now locked my door and turned off his phone. I did not cry. I just waited for morning. The next morning, Dennis filed a criminal complaint for unlawful exclusion. At the same time, we initiated an emergency petition for restoration of possession in civil court. Dennis said the case was straightforward. The deed, my registered address, neighbor witnesses who had seen me ringing. In less than a week, the court issued a temporary order. Walter and Diane had to give me access to the house within 48 hours or face forced enforcement. At the same time, I engaged another attorney to revise the will with clauses protecting the property from any disposition without my consent during my lifetime. While the court was working, Walter called. His voice had that conciliatory tone I recognize from construction negotiations. The voice of the man who knows he is lost but is trying to salvage what he can. He said it had been a misunderstanding, that Diane changed the lock because they had been having trouble with break-ins in the neighborhood, that they had forgotten to tell me, that of course they could give me a key right away. I listened to all of that with calm. Then I said, "Walter, tomorrow at 10 the enforcement officer arrives with the court order. If you have not given me access before 9, they will break the door down." Walter was silent. Then he said he understood. I told him I was glad he did. Walter left a key in the mailbox that same day with a note. "I'm sorry, Dad." That was all. 2 words on a piece of paper. I walked into my own house and stood in the hallway longer than I could explain. The hallway smelled different. Some new cleaning product, some unfamiliar food, something that was not the smell of my house. Margaret's preserves were still on the basement shelves. The rose garden was still along the fence. Her armchair was still in its place by the window. The house remembered. I stayed inside, closed the door, and sat down on the floor of the hallway. I just sat there. Gary and Linda called 3 days later. Linda was crying. Gary was formal and asked for a meeting. I agreed to meet them at a coffee shop, neutral ground. Gary said they thought the arrangement was already settled with Walter, that they had not known I had not agreed. I looked at him and saw a man who knows he is lying, but who hopes the lie will hold because there are no witnesses. I said, "Gary, the lock on my door was not a misunderstanding. It was a plan, and the plan did not work. I have nothing more to discuss." I stood up, paid for my coffee, and left. Walter came several times in the weeks that followed. I always let him in, always made coffee. I was not cold, but I was not the same. There is a difference between forgiving and returning to the same position. Forgiving is an internal process that has nothing to do with how much trust you extend going forward. Walter was slowly beginning to understand that. I could see it in how he sat, how he chose his words, how he no longer assumed access to what was not his. Patricia was furious with Walter, furious with Diane, furious with the situation. Once she said, "Dad, I had no idea." I told her I believed her. Diane stopped coming. I did not forbid it. I told Walter that Diane was welcome whenever she wanted, but she did not come. I think she knew she no longer had that invisible access she had before, the kind that was assumed, never spoken aloud but always there. Now every visit was a visit, not an entry into something she also considered hers. That difference was enough. Gary and Linda did not return at all. I did not send them any message. It was not necessary. The line was clear. I sat one afternoon in the living room and looked at Margaret's armchair. They had not moved it while they were there. I noticed that when I came back. It was not a deliberate gesture, neither kind nor unkind. The chair was simply in its place. I thought about her and about what she would have said. She would have said, "Frank, I knew." She would have said it quietly, without triumph, because that was not who she was. And I thought that the house now had a single owner who sat in it and made decisions about it. A single owner who had been locked out and who came back, and who will never let that happen again. The will was modified. Walter's share was not removed. I did not want to punish my son for a plan his wife and her parents had drawn up, though the line between his participation and his knowledge was not always clear. But the terms are different. The house cannot be sold without my authorization during my lifetime. The house cannot be mortgaged without my authorization during my lifetime. Walter receives the house when I am gone, but he cannot do anything with it while I am alive without my explicit written consent. The attorney said it was a standard protection clause. I told him it was my only priority in the entire document. There is a kind of kindness that does damage, not to those it is directed at, to the one who gives it. For years I was accessible, warm, understanding. I did not ask questions when I should have. I did not ask for explanations when they were needed. I did not react to signals I saw but chose not to see. That was not weakness in the dramatic sense. It was habit. The habit of a man raised in a home where problems were resolved with silence and patience. Silence and patience do not resolve everything. Sometimes the only thing that works is an attorney's phone number and a court order for restoration. Gary asked me once, years before that door, how much my house was worth. He said it in passing, as a question without intent. I gave him a vague figure. He nodded and continued the conversation. Now I know it was not a question without intent. It was the first step of a valuation. The valuation took years and ended with a lock on my door. I did not see it because I was not looking. I was not looking because I assumed we were all on the same side. Assuming without checking is the most expensive cognitive habit a person can have, more expensive than any structural miscalculation I ever made in 40 years of engineering. Patricia told me something once that I have not forgotten. She said, "Dad, Diane and her parents were talking about the house from the wedding. I asked her why she had not told me. She said, 'I thought you knew.' She thought I knew. Everyone thought everyone knew, and nobody was saying it out loud. That was the problem. Families function like systems, and a system without clear rules and clear limits operates according to the rules of its most aggressive participant. Gary was the most aggressive participant in our system, and he operated according to rules he had set himself because nobody else had set their own. The rose garden bloomed that spring the way it does every year. I stood along the fence and looked at the flowers Margaret had planted and thought that the house continues, that the garden continues, that some things have a memory that does not depend on us. The neighbor across the street waved at me from his window. The woman from the corner came over for some eggs. The life of the street went on as if nothing had happened. Because for the street, nothing had happened. For the street, I had always been there. I was only outside for a short time. I came back and continued. I learned one thing that is not taught in school and is not learned easily. Property is not only a legal concept. Property is also a daily affirmation, presence, decisions, limits that you set and defend every day. The document in the deed is necessary and important, but the document alone is not enough if every day you cede ground, if every day you stay quiet about what you should not stay quiet about, if every day you allow another person's will to fill the space left by your own. The locked door was just the final step of a long process of concessions. I allowed that process, and I stopped it. Walter came one Sunday alone, without Diane, without an agenda. We sat in the kitchen and drank coffee for no particular reason. We were quiet for a while. Then Walter said, "Dad, I did not tell you everything." I said I knew. He said he had known about the plan, not all of it, but part of it. He said he thought it was going to be good for everyone. I listened to him all the way through. Then I said, "Walter, good for everyone without asking me, that is not good for me." Walter nodded. He nodded for a long time, longer than agreement requires. And then he said, "I know, Dad." I think that was the first truth that had no excuse behind it. Dennis asked me once, between papers and stamps, how I was doing. I said, "Fine." He asked if I really meant it. I told him, "Dennis, the strangest thing is I feel better than I have in the last 10 years. Not happier, better. Like an engineer who finally saw that his plan was wrong and corrected it. An error in the plan is not a catastrophe. The catastrophe is continuing to build with the wrong plan because too much has already been invested. I built 10 years with the wrong plan. The locked door was the error I could not ignore, and I did not ignore it. I did what an engineer does. I corrected it. One night I went down to the basement and looked at Margaret's preserves. Strawberry jam, apple butter, bread and butter pickles, with her handwriting on the labels. I took out a jar of strawberry jam and put it on the kitchen shelf. I did not open it right away. I just looked at it for several days. One morning I spread some on toast and ate it in silence at the kitchen table. Margaret would have been satisfied, not because of the jam, but because the house is still being used, because the space is still lived in, because someone sits at that table and eats and thinks, because the house did not end up just as a padlock in someone else's plan. I am 71 years old and I live in the house where I have lived for 32 years. I have Margaret's rose garden that blooms on its own every spring. I have a son who comes by arrangement and to whom I give coffee and space to talk. I have Margaret's preserves in the basement that will last for years. I have an attorney I can call without hesitation. And I have a locked door that one afternoon taught me more than 10 years of kindness and assumption. I do not regret those 10 years. I only regret that it took me so long to understand. But I understood, and that is enough to keep going. Before you close this video, I want to ask you one concrete question. Is your name the only name on the deed to your property? And can anyone change something on your assets without your signature and your physical presence? Most owners assume they are protected. Most owners have not checked. If this video made you think of something you need to review, subscribe now, because the next videos are about exactly that, what nobody explains to you about protecting what you built. And write me in the comments, what is the first thing you are going to check this week? Your answer may help someone else reading this.